roll. Miss Sikkum, Mrs. Mosscrop Smythe and Mr. Bolton each lost their rolls, which were retrieved from underneath the table by Gustave and Alice. Mr. Sefton, also unconscious of the secreted roll, opened his napkin with a debonair jerk to show that he was quite at his ease. The bread rose in the air. He made an unsuccessful clutch, touched but could not hold it, and watched with horror the errant roll hit Miss Wangle playfully on the side of the nose, just as she was beginning to tell Bowen about the dear bishop. Patricia bit her lip. Bowen bent solicitously over the angry Miss Wangle, whilst Mr. Bolton threatened to report Mr. Sefton to the food controller. Gustave created a diversion by arriving with the soup. His white cotton gloves, several sizes too large even for his hands, caused him great anxiety. Every spare moment during the evening he spent in clutching them at the wrists, just as they were on the point of slipping off. Nothing, however, could daunt his courage or mitigate his good humour. For the first time in his life he was waiting upon a real lord, and from the circumstance he was extracting every ounce of satisfaction it possessed. In serving Bowen his attitude was that of one self-convicted of unworthiness. Accustomed to the complaints and bickerings of a Bayswater boarding-house, Bowen's matter-of-fact motions of acceptance or refusal impressed him profoundly. So this was how lords behaved. Nothing so impressed him as the little incident of the champagne. At Galvin House it was the custom for the guests to have their own drinks. Mr. Cordal, for instance, drank what the label on the bottle announced to be Gumpton's Superior Light Dinner Ale. Mrs. Mosscrop Smythe favoured Guinness's Stout. Miss Sikkum took hot water, whilst Miss Wangle satisfied herself with a claret bottle. There was refinement in claret. The dear bishop always drank it with water, but as claret costs money, Miss Wangle made a bottle last for months. The thought of the usual heterogeneous collection of bottles on the occasion of Lord Peter's visit had filled Mrs. Craske Morton with horror, and she had decided to spring wine, as Mr. Bolton put it. In other words, she supplied for the whole company 4 bottles of 1 8-penny claret, the bottles rendered beautifully old by applied dust and cobwebs. To this she had added a bottle of grocer's champagne for Bowen. Gustave had been elaborately instructed that this was for the principal guest and the principal guest only, and Mrs. Craske Morton had managed to convey to him in some subtle way that if he poured so much as a drop of the precious fluid into any other person's glass, the consequences would be too terrifying even to contemplate. Whilst Galvin House was murmuring softly over its soup, Gustave approached Bowen with a champagne bottle swathed in a white napkin and looking suspiciously like an infant in long clothes. Holding the end of the bottle's ropes with the left hand so that it should not tickle Bowen's ear, Gustave bent anxiously to his task. Bowen, however, threw a bombshell at the earnest servitor. He motioned that he did not desire champagne. Gustave hesitated and looked inquiringly at his mistress. Here was an unlooked-for development. "You'll take champagne?" inquired Mrs. Craske Morton ingratiatingly. Gustave breathed again, and whilst Bowen's attention was distracted in explaining to Mrs. Craske Morton that he preferred water, he had a delicate taste in wine, Gustave filled the glass happily. Of course it was all right, he told himself, the lord merely wanted to be pressed. If he had really meant no, he would have put his hand over his glass, as Miss Sikkum always did when she refused some of Mr. Cordal's light dinner ale. Gustave retired victorious with the champagne bottle, which he placed upon the sideboard. At every interval in his manifold duties, Gustave returned with the white-clothed bottle and strove to squeeze a few more drops into Bowen's untouched glass. The terrifying constraint with which the meal had opened gradually wore off as the wine circulated. Following the path of least resistance, it mounted to Mrs. Mosscrop Smythe's head, but with Miss Sikkum it seemed to stop short at her nose. Mr. Cordal's shirt front announced that he had temporarily given up Gumpton in favour of the red wine of the smoking concert baritone. Mrs. Barnes seemed on the point of tears, whilst Mr. Sefton's attentions to Patricia were a direct challenge to Bowen. Conversation at Galvin House was usually general, but it now became particular. Every remark was directed either to or at Bowen, and each guest strove to hear what he said. Those who were fortunate enough to catch his replies told those who were not. A smile or a laugh from anyone who might be in conversation with Bowen rippled down the table. Mr. Cordal was less intent upon his food, and his inaccuracy of aim became more than ever noticeable. "Oh, Lord Bowen," simpered Miss Sikkum, "do tell us where you got the D.S.O." Bowen screwed his glass into his eye and looked across at Miss Sikkum, at the redness of her nose and the artificial rose in her hair. Everyone was waiting anxiously for Bowen's reply. Mr. Cordal grunted approval. "At Buckingham Palace," said Bowen. "From the King. They give you special leave, you know." Patricia looked across at him and smiled. What was he thinking of Galvin House refinement? What did he think of her for being there? Well, he had brought it on himself, and he deserved his punishment. At first Patricia had been amused, but as the meal dragged wearily on, amusement developed into torture. Would it never end? She glanced from Miss Wangle, all graciousness and smiles, to Mrs. Mosscrop Smythe, in her faded blue evening frock, on to Miss Sikkum, bare and abandoned. She heard Mr. Sefton's chatter, Mr. Bolton's laugh, Mr. Cordal's jaws and lips. She shuddered. Why did she not accept the opening of escape that now presented itself, and marry Bowen? He could rescue her from all this and what it meant. "And shall we all be asked to the wedding, Lord Bowen?" It was again Miss Sickham's thin voice that broke through the curtain of Patricia's thoughts. "I hope all Miss Brent's friends will be there," replied Bowen diplomatically. "And now we shall all have to fetch and carry for Miss Brent," laughed Mr. Bolton. "Am I your friend, Miss Brent?" he inquired. "She always laughs at your jokes when nobody else can," snapped Miss Pilkington. Everybody turned to the speaker, who during the whole meal had silently nursed her resentment at having been placed at the bottom of the table. Mr. Bolton looked crestfallen. Bowen looked across at Patricia and saw her smile sympathetically at Mr. Bolton. "I think from what I have heard, Mr. Bolton," he said, "that you may regard yourself as one of the elect." Patricia flashed Bowen a grateful look. Mr. Bolton beamed and, turning to Miss Pilkington, said with his usual introductory laugh, "Then I shall return good for evil, Miss Pilkington, and persuade Lady Peter to buy her stamps at your place." Miss Pilkington flushed at this reference to her calling, a particularly threadbare joke of Mr. Bolton's. "When is it to be, Lord Peter?" enquired Mrs. Craske-Morton. Miss Sikkum looked down modestly at her plate, not quite certain whether or no this were a delicate question. "That rests with Miss Brent," replied Bowen, smiling. "If you, her friends, can persuade her to make it soon, I shall be very grateful." Miss Sikkum simpered and murmured under her breath, "How romantic!" "Now, Miss Brent," said Mr. Bolton, "it's up to you to name the happy day." Patricia smiled, conscious that all eyes were upon her, but particularly conscious of Bowen's gaze. "I believe in long engagements," she said, stealing a glance at Bowen, and thrilling at the look of disappointment on his face. "Didn't Jacob serve 7 years for Rachel?" "Yes, and got the wrong girl then," broke in Mr. Bolton. "You'll have to be careful, Miss Brent, or Miss Sikkum will get ahead of you." "Really, Mr. Bolton?" said Mrs. Craske-Morton, looking anxiously at Bowen. Miss Sickham's cheeks had assumed the same tint as her nose, and her eyes were riveted upon her plate. Miss Pilkington muttered something under her breath about Mr. Bolton's remark being outrageous. "I think we'll take coffee in the lounge," said Mrs. Craske-Morton, rising. Turning to Bowen, she added, "We follow the American custom, Lord Peter. The gentlemen always leave the dining room with the ladies." There was a pushing back of chairs and a shuffling of feet, and Galvin House rose from its repast. "Coffee will not be served for half an hour, and if you and Miss Brent would like to... Mrs. Craske-Morton paused significantly. "My boudoir is at your service." Bowen looked at her and then at Patricia. He saw the flush on her cheeks and the humiliation in her eyes. "I think we should much prefer not to interrupt our pleasant conversation. What do you say, Patricia?" he inquired, turning to Patricia, who smiled her acquiescence. They all trooped into the lounge, where everybody except Patricia, Bowen and Mrs. Craske-Morton stood about in awkward poses. The arrival of Gustave with coffee relieved the tension. For the next hour each guest endeavoured to attract to himself or herself Bowen's attention, and each was disappointed when at length he rose to go and shook hands only with Mrs. Craske-Morton, including the others in a comprehensive bow. Still more were they disappointed and surprised when Patricia did not go out into the hall to see him off. "Oh, Miss Brent," simpered Miss Sikkum, "aren't you going to say good night to him?" "Good night?" interrogated Patricia. "But I did." "Yes, but I mean," began Miss Sikkum. "Oh, you know," she said with a simper, but Patricia had passed over to a chair, where she seated herself and began to read a newspaper upside down. Miss Sickham's romantic soul had received a shock. End of chapter 14.